When a senator stares down a nominee for one of the most powerful jobs in the world, it's not a show for the cameras. It's about whether America's military will be guided by real leadership or left in the hands of someone chasing headlines. Senator Peters walked into that hearing with one mission: to figure out if the Pentagon's future was in steady hands or in dangerous ones. And the way he cut straight to the heart of the matter made it clear this wasn't just another Washington performance. Peters wanted answers, and the exchange that followed pulled back the curtain on a sharp divide inside America's defense leadership. The hearing began with General Caine, a man Peters had questioned before and during his confirmation process. Peters pushed him again, asking if he was truly committed to remaining a nonpartisan leader, someone who would serve the Constitution rather than a party, a donor, or the political flavor of the moment.
In uniform. Secretary Hegseth, your approach to leadership, I believe, stands in direct conflict with the ideas that we just discussed with General Caine. And at a time of great chaos and uncertainty in the world, I'm extremely concerned that your many shortcomings could have potentially life-threatening consequences for American service members. In your confirmation hearing, I expressed my deep reservations about your qualifications to run the DoD. I also made it clear that no board of directors in the world would hire someone with so little experience to run a large business, much less the Department of Defense, where American lives are on the line regularly. For this reason, in addition to some concerns we had about character, I ultimately opposed your nomination. And unfortunately, my reservations have become reality. I know my colleagues have touched on some of these issues, but to briefly summarize, you have failed to set the example, or lead from the front, as you like to say. And this includes prompting a leadership and oversight vacuum at the department by firing qualified uniformed leaders without cause, creating loyalty tests and leak investigations that have led to 5 of your senior advisors resigning or being fired, sharing classified military details on an unsecure app during operations in Yemen that included unauthorized individuals on at least 2 separate occasions, and revoking the DoD personal protection detail for both Secretary of Defense Mark Esper and the former Chairman of Joint Chiefs Mark Milley, putting their safety at risk while they are still under threat from Iran. We have seen time and time again how your conduct, lack of personal responsibility, are harming readiness, reputation, and professionalism of our military. At a time where Israel and Iran are in open conflict and our adversaries in Russia and China will exploit any weaknesses, unfortunately, my worst fears about your leadership shortfalls, unfortunately, have been realized. Secretary Hegseth, I firmly believe that accountability from leadership is vital in all sectors, not just in the military. And demonstrating to your subordinates that everyone plays by the same rules helps to build trust and open communications within your team. And those two things are extremely important. And I know that you share my desire to ensure that we're holding our senior leaders accountable for actions. And during your nomination hearing, you stated, quote, "Accountability is coming because everybody in this room knows if you are a rifleman and you lose your rifle, they are throwing the book at you," end of quote. You also said that leadership has been unwilling to take accountability, and I couldn't agree more on how important accountability is. As we all know, at the request of this committee, the Department of Defense Inspector General launched an investigation into your use of Signal, an unclassified commercially available messaging application to discuss information pertaining military actions in Yemen. So given your focus on accountability, how will you demonstrate this accountability to the men and women in the U.S. military if the Inspector General finds that you improperly disclosed information?
That assessment is pending at this time.
That is a hypothetical question, but the gentleman's time has expired.
I think your answer is clear. You are not going to be held accountable.
Thank you very much, Senator Peters.
Caine didn't fumble, he didn't hide behind platitudes. He spoke about servant leadership, about weighing global challenges, and about always putting the oath of office first. To the room, it was a reminder that some leaders don't just say they're apolitical, they actually live it. Caine stressed his role was to present the president with the best military options, rooted not in ideology but in duty. Peters seemed satisfied, even respectful, thanking Caine as a fellow naval officer and acknowledging his commitment to the men and women in uniform. But then Peters pivoted, and the tone shifted like a storm rolling in. The spotlight moved to Secretary Hegseth, and instantly the questions carried a different weight. Unlike Caine, Hegseth wasn't entering this hearing with a clean slate. Over his head hung the Signal app investigation, a controversy that raised serious doubts about his judgment. Reports claim he had shared sensitive military information on an unsecured commercially available app that included unauthorized individuals. For anyone in the Pentagon, that's bad. For someone seeking to lead the Department of Defense, it's catastrophic. Peters didn't bother dressing it up. His message was clear: leadership isn't about flag-wrapped speeches or cable news soundbites, it's about accountability when lives are on the line. From the start, Peters reminded everyone that his opposition to Hegseth wasn't born in that hearing room. He had already spoken against the nomination months earlier, citing two glaring problems. First, the lack of qualifications. Running the Pentagon isn't like running a think tank or a media show, it's managing the largest and most complex organization on the planet. Second, character concerns. Peters pointed out that no board of directors in the corporate world would put someone with such thin experience in charge of a massive company, yet somehow this same resume was being treated as acceptable for leading the U.S. military. Back when Peters raised these alarms, some brushed them aside as partisan games. But as he laid out the record, those concerns looked less like political posturing and more like prophecy. The fallout under Hegseth's watch had been undeniable. Qualified military leaders were fired without legitimate cause. Loyalty tests replaced merit, as if the Department of Defense was being reshaped into a personal club rather than a fighting force. Leak investigations turned into witch hunts, poisoning morale instead of building trust. And in the middle of it all, 5 senior advisors either resigned or were forced out. Think about that: 5 advisors in critical national security roles leaving under one secretary. That's not coincidence, that's dysfunction. Peters called it what it was: a vacuum of leadership. And when the Pentagon has a vacuum at the top, that vacuum doesn't stay empty. It gets filled with instability, confusion, and openings for adversaries to exploit. The details only grew more alarming. According to reports, Hegseth had twice shared sensitive operational details of U.S. military actions in Yemen through unsecured channels. This wasn't idle chatter, it involved missions where American lives were at stake. And as if that weren't reckless enough, he also revoked personal protection details for former Defense Secretary Mark Esper and General Mark Milley, even though both remained under active threat from Iran. Removing their security didn't just raise eyebrows, it put lives in real danger. The combination of those actions signaled to Peters that the Pentagon wasn't being led responsibly. It was being toyed with, as if national security itself were a prop in a personal performance. By now, Peters wasn't painting the picture of 1 or 2 slip-ups. He was describing a consistent pattern, a black hole of leadership at the worst possible moment. Military readiness was being weakened. Trust in the chain of command was eroding, reputation on the global stage was suffering, and all of it stemmed from a simple, devastating truth: there was no accountability at the top. Peters explained that when service members see generals and secretaries dodging responsibility while punishing rank-and-file soldiers for even the smallest errors, trust collapses. And without trust, discipline falls apart. In that kind of environment, adversaries like Russia, China, and Iran don't just watch, they pounce. That's why Peters aimed one final devastating question at Hegseth. If the Inspector General concluded that he had mishandled sensitive information in the Signal scandal, how would he demonstrate accountability to the troops? How would he show the men and women he commanded that he understood the very principle he'd preached about in his own confirmation? The answer should have been simple: accept responsibility, but instead Hegseth deflected. He called it hypothetical. He sidestepped, he filled the air with empty words, and in that silence Peters' point was made. This wasn't leadership, this was avoidance. Peters' time ran out, but the damage was already done. The troops watching, the public listening, they could see it plainly. Hegseth wasn't prepared to own his mistakes. Not then. Not ever. What this hearing revealed went far beyond one heated exchange. It highlighted the dangerous divide in America's defense leadership. On one side stood Caine, a general committed to servant leadership, guided by duty to the Constitution. On the other stood Hegseth, a secretary whose actions had raised more questions than answers, more risks than reassurances. And at the center of it all was Peters, hammering home the lesson that leadership without accountability is no leadership at all. This wasn't about partisan battles or political theater, it was about the stakes that come with running the Pentagon. Those stakes aren't measured in poll numbers. They're measured in American lives, in global stability, in whether enemies believe the United States can still project strength and unity. If the wrong person sits at the top, the consequences aren't abstract. They're body bags. They're destabilized regions. Their families torn apart by wars that could have been prevented with stronger judgment. Peters' confrontation forced the country to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. Too often leaders talk about accountability like it's a slogan. They throw it around in speeches, slap it on press releases, and then run from it the moment reality gets tough. Real accountability isn't about talking, it's about standing in the fire and owning the mistakes that could cost others their lives. And that was the difference on display. Caine, who promised to stay grounded in his oath, versus Hegseth, who couldn't give a straight answer when the stakes were highest. The exchange left a lingering question: do Americans want leaders who see the Pentagon as a sacred trust, or ones who see it as a stepping stone to the next TV contract? Because at the end of the day, it can't be both. If the Department of Defense becomes just another stage for political ambition, then the very foundation of military readiness crumbles. And when that happens, it's not politicians who pay the price, it's the service members sent into danger. So the hearing ended, but the larger story didn't. Peters sent a message that went far beyond one nominee: if you want the privilege of commanding the U.S. military, you'd better be ready to live the accountability you demand from your troops. Because in the armed forces, a private who loses his rifle faces consequences. And by that same standard, a secretary who risks national security should too. And that's where the debate lands today. Was Peters right to push this hard? Was he protecting the institution of the military from being dragged into another round of reckless leadership? Or was Hegseth, as some of his defenders might argue, unfairly targeted by political enemies? Those are the questions echoing beyond the hearing room. They're the questions every American has to consider when leadership is on the line. What do you think? Was Peters exposing a dangerous lack of accountability, or was this just another Washington clash dressed up as a crisis? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to subscribe, because the next story we're covering is even more controversial, and it could reshape how the nation sees its leaders once again.